In the last few years, there has been a big resurgence in tailwheel flying. The love of the old classic warbirds seems to be lasting forever, and then backcountry flying has gained a lot of popularity, probably due in part to some of the big YouTube channels like Trent Palmer or Flight Chops, or some of the other channels that feature tailwheel aircraft. Today, perhaps surprisingly, there are still brand new tailwheel aircraft being built and bought and sold all the time. And the older vintage tailwheel aircraft seems to be retaining their popularity, maybe even becoming more popular than in years past. For example, if you look at my Aeronca Chief here, this aircraft sat in pieces, probably in somebody's barn, from the late 70s to the late 90s. And it was only around that period of the late 90s, early 2000s, when the aircraft was reassembled and rebuilt and brought back to life, and it's been flying since then. It's coming up on 80 years old, and it's still flying today. All that being said, you might notice one thing in common about almost all of the tailwheel aircraft that are flying today, and that is that they are single-engine airplanes. So where's the love for the multi-engine tailwheel aircraft? Why are they so rare, and why are they becoming more rare every day? All right, so welcome back to Heavy Metal Horizons. We do cars, aviation, and radio here at this channel. And if you like that stuff, be sure you are subscribed. Now, recently, I've been able to get some first-hand experience with a couple of classic twin-engine taildraggers, specifically the C-45 or the Beech 18. C-45 is the military designation. And then also a Howard 250, which is a hot-rodded and modified Lockheed Lodestar. Both of these aircraft are incredible machines, and while they do have some differences between them, they've both really opened my eyes to why these multi-engine tailwheel aircraft are becoming so rare. Now, if we take the Beech 18 or the C-45 as an example, to be honest, these aircraft are just really a handful to fly. When you think about all of the different systems that are going on in the aircraft, and the fact that the Beech 18 in particular is a single pilot aircraft, and there's no automation. Everything is manual. So it's a traditional complex aircraft. So you've got your flaps, landing gear, and your prop controls. Then you also have cowl flaps. You have oil bypass controls. You have a manually locking and unlocking tail wheel. And you have controls for both engines' superchargers, and you have 5 different fuel tanks. And you quite possibly have no co-pilot. So this is going to be all on you, in addition to flying the airplane, doing the radio calls, and navigation. I talked to the pilot of the C-45 that was flown at an air event recently, and he was telling me that for those reasons, the lack of automation and the fact that it's a single pilot aircraft, that makes that aircraft more challenging to fly than actually larger multi-engine taildraggers. And the examples he was using was like a B-25 or even a B-17, because on those aircraft you have a dedicated co-pilot that helps you manage all of that stuff. Now, with the Howard 250, which is a much larger aircraft, you at least have some automatic systems, but just look at the complexity of the panel here. I got to talk with Todd Schultz, who flies the Howard 250 as part of the collection in the Golden Age Flight Museum, which he founded, and he told me about some of the peculiarities of flying that aircraft.
Clear takeoff 30 right, runway heading 0 Tango's here.
In traffic, Sigma Quebec. Or 587 traffic,
Tailwheel
1
lock.
o'clock.
48 inches, 2700.
5,000 descending Learjet. Looking for traffic, we're going to turn heading the southbound, 587. Go whiskey is off at Echo. 46 Golf Whiskey, Roger, full short 30 right at Echo, depart traffic. 4030 right at Echo, traffic Echo. Tower 30 full, traffic left down approach, and return to base now for the Pelham runway, Cessna.
100.
takeoff is interesting, actually, because on the tailwheel airplane, when the tail is down, the wing deflects the air outwards mostly. So the airflow over the vertical fins for your rudders isn't very good. So on initial acceleration, the rudders don't do much at all until you get to about 70 knots or so and the tail starts coming up. The airflow changes over the rudders and you get much better rudder control. So on initial power up on takeoff, with the torque of the engines, if you just ran the throttles up smooth together, the torque and the P factor just yanks you off to the left side of the runway and you have to stand on the right brake to make it go straight. And dragging the brake on takeoff is not good for takeoff performance. So you have to run the left throttle up quite a bit higher initially than the right. Performance on that, the props are already on the prop governors, and the manifold pressure on the left engine is about 10 inches higher than the right engine on that acceleration from about 20 knots up until about 80 knots. Once you get to about 80, the tail's up, you're moving along, you match the throttles, and it'll go nice and straight. So the Howard 250, it cruises depending on weight. Myself and a couple other people with half tanks of gas, if we climb up to about 14.5, it'll indicate 200 knots, which is about 260 or so true airspeed. So it moves along. The original Lodestar went about 180 knots. So with all the mods on it, it's much faster. 1,100 gallons of fuel. 1,350 horse per side on the engines. They're Wright 1820-56As. The DC-3 used the same engine on some of the airplanes. We got 12 seats in the back, 2 pilots required. The max takeoff weight is 22,500 pounds. We have the range to go LA to New York nonstop, both ways. We can make it to Hawaii with a couple hours of range to spare. So the performance is surprisingly good for an airplane from the 60s with radial engines.
Okay, so these aircraft are a challenge to fly, but if there's a good reason to fly them, then you do it anyway, even though it's hard. But that brings us to the next issue. What are multi-engine tailwheel aircraft still used for? With the exception of a few edge cases where you have to fly a large aircraft or an aircraft that's capable of carrying a lot of cargo into a very remote, backcountry type place where you have a dirt strip or gravel strip or something like that. With the exception of a few cases like that, these aircraft are just not as practical as they used to be. I'm in Southern California here, and so most of the multi-engine tailwheel aircraft are flying around purely for exhibition purposes, or in a few rare cases, they're just owned by private owners who are just burning gas for fun. And while a smaller single-engine tailwheel aircraft, those are inexpensive enough to own and maintain and operate, there's not that many people that are going to own a DC-3 just for doing pleasure flights, going to Catalina to get a buffalo burger. I mean, there's probably a few people doing it, but it's rare to say the least. All right, so these aircraft are not as practical as they used to be, and they can be a challenge to fly. But the other issue is there's such a small pool of pilots that are capable and qualified to fly these aircraft. In flying, I think you have these two very different groups of pilots. On one hand, you have the purely recreational pilots, and there are a lot of tailwheel pilots in that group, all the backcountry guys, right, or the guys who are, flying cowboys, that kind of thing, right? You've got those pilots, and while they might have great stick and rudder skills and a lot of tailwheel experience, very few of them are going to have multi-engine experience or multi-engine rating. And then on the other side, you've got the classic airliner pilot, group of people, right? and they're going to have, you know, complex and multi-engine experience, ATP or something, but a lot of those guys have zero tailwheel experience. And so where those two groups, you know, in the Venn diagram, where those two groups of pilots overlap, that's a very small area where you can actually get pilots that are going to be able and, you know, have the right certifications and so forth to fly a multi-engine taildragger. Now, it used to be that there were older pilots around who had flown these aircraft back in the day when those aircraft were new. But we're getting to the point now where, you know, these aircraft are from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. In some cases, the airplanes are 80 years old or even more. So you get this weird situation where the aircraft is still on the original first generation, but now we're on like the second or even third generation of pilots. And so the aircraft themselves have actually outlived the pilots that originally flew them. And there's a lot of, I think, specialized skills and knowledge that goes into flying these big multi-engine taildraggers. And like some of the nuances that Todd was talking about there, if that information doesn't get passed down to the new pilots that are coming in, you know, we're going to lose that knowledge. And it'll just make it harder and harder and harder to keep these aircraft maintained and flying. Now, I currently don't have a multi-engine rating, but I do want to get one because I want to get myself in the position where I can help keep these aircraft in the air where they belong. I think these airplanes do still have a very practical role to play, and that is that they are helpful for pilots to fly simply because they are challenging aircraft to fly. Challenges, you know, being a hard aircraft to fly, that makes us better pilots when we fly these planes. Pilots are always trying to avoid complacency, right, and getting too comfortable because then you start to get sloppy. And even if most of your flying is flying, you know, either a very basic airplane or maybe an airplane that is very procedural or something, and you memorize these procedures and you do them the same way over and over again. Regardless of the situation, if you go from that to flying an airplane that's really hard and really a challenge to fly, when you go back to what you're used to, it seems so much easier than before. As an example, when I fly, you know, learning to fly the Aeronca Chief, which is a tailwheel airplane, but a very simple airplane, or maybe a better example is that recently I got some T6 time, which was incredible. But going from an airplane like that to then going back to flying the flight school's 172 or Piper Cherokee, now those aircraft seem so easy in comparison. After a T6, I feel like I could fly the 172 in my sleep. So look, I'll just close by saying that I hope that we collectively can keep these classic multi-engine tailwheel aircraft flying and not let them fade away and die a slow death. Some of them are approaching 100 years old, like the Ford Trimotor that's still flying today, and that plane is almost 100 years old now. I'd like to see that plane flying in 200 years. All right, guys, so that is it. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know your thoughts about all this stuff down in the comments section below. And guys, if you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up, subscribe for more if you enjoy videos like this, and I'll see you next time.